findings from a 4-year Australian Research Council funded study, arts-based social enterprise and marginalised young people's transitions, led by Professor Peter Kelly, Dr. Grace McQuilten, Associate Professor Kimberly Humphery, and Dr. Amy Spiers of RMIT University, and Dr. Deborah Warr of Charles Sturt University. Our event supporters of today are RMIT's Design and Creative Practice platform, the Contemporary Art and Social Transformation Research Group, which is known as CAST, the School of Art, the UNESCO UEOC Centre, and the School of Education. So before we begin, some basic housekeeping, which I think we're all getting pretty familiar with, the Zoomlandia and the Teamlands etiquette. But just to remind you, this event is being recorded. As people are let in, we've got it automatically set so everybody's video and mics will be on mute. That we ask everyone to keep their mics off during the launch. In terms of questions, there's the chat. If you can put questions in the chat during the conversations, that would be fantastic. And then at the end, we'll come back to that and answer, hopefully, all your questions. So in terms of the event structure, we'll begin with a critical policy brief in its research underpinnings, discussed by Dr. Grace McQuilten. The critical policy brief will then be officially launched by Nicholas Verginis of, is that okay? Kind of, yeah, of the Social Enterprise Network of Victoria, followed by our esteemed panel of speakers comprising of Professor Peter Kelly of RMIT, Kate Gillick of Outer Urban Projects, Farouque of the Social Studio, and Professor Joe Barraket of Swinburne. We will end the event by taking questions from the audience. As I said, please pop questions in every time a little idea or question pops into your mind, pop them in the chat and we'll address them at the end. So let me first begin with introducing you to Grace and Nick. So firstly, Grace McQuilten is an art historian, curator, writer, and also a new mother as well. You might get to see her lovely, beautiful, captivating young son who mesmerised us before this event. She has published the books Art as Enterprise, Social and Economic Engagement in Contemporary Art, co-authored with Dr. Anthony White, and Art in Consumer Culture. Grace has worked extensively in social enterprise and community development alongside her academic career and founded the Social Studio in 2009, a fashion-based social enterprise that supports young people from migrant and refugee backgrounds. Nick Verginis is the CEO of the Social Enterprise Network Victoria, responsible for growing the social enterprise community in Victoria. Nick thrives in cross-sector collaborations and has over 20 years experience in the independent arts sector, non-for-profits and small social enterprises. For the past 7 years, he served on the board of the Melbourne Fringe and launched Common Rooms in 2019, the new venue at Trades Hall in Carlton that uses social enterprise to provide a space where uncommon people can belong. I'll hand over to Grace and Nick.
Thanks so much, Larissa. As Larissa mentioned, I am holding a very small 7-week-old baby who may be a little bit noisy as I speak, so just bear with me. I'm going to try to keep him as quiet as I can. So today's policy brief, as Larissa mentioned, has come out of an ARC-funded research project, which started back in 2017. The project started with the premise of wanting to understand in greater depth how art-based social enterprises engage young people in learning and work experience opportunities and support them to transition into further education and employment. For those of you wondering what is an art-based social enterprise, these are organisations that bring together creative arts activities, with commercial business activities in order to create some kind of social change. In particular, our researchers wanted to address some key gaps in knowledge about art-based social enterprise. So while there's much interest in the model, particularly for its ability to engage young people, creative arts activities tap into youth cultures and to creativity and are very engaging, particularly for young people who might have struggled in mainstream educational work settings. So while there's a great deal of interest in how the model works, there's a profound lack of evidence in terms of both how the models operate and also how they work to really create those educational and employment transitions. So our project has delved deeply into the experiences of practitioners in social enterprises across Australia to try to understand both the organisational models, but more particularly, what is the lived experience for people involved in these organisations. Both as managers trying to negotiate often conflicting goals of creating artistic outputs, social outcomes and commercial outcomes, and also the experiences and the particular understandings and perspectives of young people that are involved. What does it mean for them to be involved in these sorts of organisations, and what does the future look like for them as well? So the first stage of our project involved us interviewing managers from art-based social enterprises across Australia in order to understand the opportunities and the challenges of the model, and to get a deeper insight into how they operate, and in particular what social impact means to these organisations. The next stage of the project has involved in-depth case studies with 3 art-based social enterprises in Victoria. That includes Outer Urban Projects, which works with young people in the outer northern suburbs of Melbourne, and we've got Kate Gillick here as part of the panel to speak more to their work. The second organisation is the Social Studio, which Larissa has already mentioned, a fashion-based social enterprise that works with young people from refugee backgrounds. And we've got Farah Farouque here today, also on the panel to speak a bit more to their work. And finally, Youthworx Media Productions, who work with young people experiencing insecure housing and other sorts of barriers to education and employment. And they work through digital media production training and also employment in their business. So these 3 case studies provided us with an opportunity to really dive deeply into the work of the organisations, to understand the lived experience of all those involved, and to think carefully about how their experiences might speak to broader issues in the sector, both for the arts industry and also the social enterprise sector. One outcome coming out of that case study stage of the project is an exciting exhibition at Bus Projects, which will be launched in the new year in January, where artists from each of those 3 organisations will share their perspectives on issues around work, equality and crisis, particularly timely given the unbelievable year that we've all had this year, which has really deeply impacted both young people in terms of employment and also the arts sector as well. So the third and final stage of our research project is industry engagement, where we aim to test the findings of our research with industry and also translate it for broader application. And that leads me to today's launch of our critical policy brief. So I'm just going to quickly run through the key messages in the brief before I hand over to Nick, who will then officially launch it. So I'm assuming that everybody can see this. Larissa, can you give me a thumbs up to make sure? Great. So firstly, the first key message that we wanted to convey from the research is that art-based social enterprises do play a vital role in enabling young people in varied circumstances of marginalisation to engage with the wider community and enhance their well-being. And these are essential preconditions for formulating pathways into education or employment. So while the focus often in these sorts of organisations and in the sector is on sort of quantifiable measures of transition into employment and education, what we found was that there's an important step before that, which is about nurturing the health and well-being of these young people, that is really essential for them to then be able to think about what transitions into education and employment look like. And often there's not enough of a focus of what the impact of these sort of health and well-being outcomes are on young people. So fostering confidence, improving mental health and well-being, which then supports them to engage more deeply in learning activities and to feel ambitious about pursuing work opportunities as well. The next key message is that 80% of art-based social enterprises do not achieve the expectation that social enterprises generate the majority of their income from trade. Instead, hybrid funding models are preferred as they better support core mission activities to support young people. So this speaks to a real tug of war in these sorts of organisations between pursuing commercial activities and social outcomes at the same time. And what we found is that the organisations are incredibly innovative at engaging with markets and finding new revenue streams through commercial activity, but that they preferred that to not be the sole focus, and that in order to achieve the sorts of social outcomes that they're trying to achieve, they preferred organisational models that also brought in revenue through funding and donations and other means. So that leads me to the third key message, which is that art-based social enterprises that have funding streams that support longer-term planning and operational costs tend to report greater capacity to create positive social outcomes and also, interestingly, to further develop their enterprise streams. Finally, we found that art-based social enterprises are empowering young people through arts and cultural activities with a focus on their strengths rather than deficits. So rather than looking at the problems and issues or the forms of marginalisation that brought them into the organisations tend to focus on their creative capacities and skills, and that really becomes the basis through which they engage and develop in the organisations. We also found that innovative art-based social enterprises are generating direct employment opportunities for young people in the creative industries through their commercial activities. So not only are young people engaging in the organisations, but they're also working directly with them. So there are our key messages. The brief itself goes into a lot more detail and provides more information and more findings. So I encourage everyone after this to download, if you haven't already, the full critical policy brief and read it. But with that, I'm delighted to hand over now to Nick, who will officially launch the document. Thank you.
Thanks, Grace. Thanks, Grace. I am very humbled to be surrounded by this esteemed panel today and to be invited to launch this research. I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and it brings together many parts of my personality and my career to bring social enterprise and the arts together in this place. It's a wonderful moment for me personally. And I also want to just acknowledge how grateful I also am to be on Wurundjeri country here in Melbourne. It's also really important to my sense of self and my sense of where I belong in this nation, that I connect with the ongoing traditions and law of the first people of this country and pay my respects to our elders, past, present, and emerging. I've had over 20 years, as was said in the intro, with my connections with the independent arts, from being involved in university life through to starting my own independent arts companies. And then I was on the board of St Martin's Arts Centre, which is one of well, I think the oldest youth arts organisation in Melbourne, perhaps in Australia, if I recall. And then on the Melbourne Fringe, where you know, I've been intrinsically involved with the struggles and challenges of the independent arts sector in the Melbourne community. And where I am now is at the top of CENVIC, the new social enterprise network that has been created really at the beginning of what is a fairly significant movement, a movement that is challenging capitalism, that is challenging the purely profit-oriented elements of our society, of the way that government connects with business, how philanthropy understands their place. There is a lot of change afoot, and COVID in a way has accelerated that. The pandemic has disrupted everything and has really shaped things up. So it's a really important time to us to really take stock, make sense, and start advocating in an organised way around certain aspects of the kind of world we want to create. So what is CENVIC? Why have I been invited to be here? So I've been in this job since January. It's a network, so it's been a pretty challenging year to lead a network, but we've done okay. And part of that is because of that momentum that's there in the zeitgeist. It's not just about what CENVIC is doing, but CENVIC is we are the practitioner-led network. And what does that mean? That means we bring together people who are leading social enterprises in Victoria, or people who are enabling social enterprises. So we have practitioners who are who cover a broad church, from the large, probably well-recognised social enterprises like Thank You and Who Gives a Crap, who are reinvesting profits of their commercial activities into charitable purposes, through to Street Cafe, which many of you may know from Collingwood. They also opened in the Youth Justice Centre in Parkville just before the pandemic, and they provide employment pathways in hospitality and in the food systems area. Others might know Green Collect, which repurpose office waste, and they're creating almost a new economy from reusing, upcycling things that the corporate sector have been discarding for years and going into landfill. So that in a way, they're creating new markets, new green markets, but with a transformative business that provides work for people who are unemployable, who are outside you know, the opportunities that the mainstream employment provides, who have not had the skills and education and support to get work. So they're them in the middle, and I suppose at the other end is neighbourhood houses and cooperatives that we take for granted. You know, these are cooperatives, organisations, communities of people who run a public asset like a neighbourhood house, and they trade by, you know, hiring it out. So trade can mean many things, and selling a product or service, you know, comes in many different forms. So we are very much representing a different way of thinking of how we organise. And part of it, yes, is trading something. And this is perhaps one of those tense bits that artists have been reluctant to acknowledge. And this is part of the sort of commercial reality that is also a challenge for the artistic community. So it's not necessarily a happy fit, and that's something worth saying. And it's really important because for me, from my experience being involved in the arts, and also, you know, my knowledge of the academic literature, is understanding that artistic participation brings positive mental health and well-being. That's been very clearly demonstrated. The value of just being involved in the arts, or to take a legal perspective, to express your right to creativity and self-expression. It's a fundamental right that hasn't really been given the economic value it ought to have in our society and in what organises us. And so CENVIC, in a way, social enterprise, is part of that movement, saying, let's start valuing, let's start measuring, and let's start raising the importance and the currency of participation in these types of activities. And so I think there's a natural fit here. While there is a tension, there's also a natural fit. that CENVIC is bringing together parts of the economy, parts of people running businesses that haven't had that visibility, they haven't had that recognition, and they haven't had a way of communicating their impact before. And one of the interesting things that is quite similar between the social enterprise community, who can be very business and very corporate at times, they're also quite community oriented and cooperative. And if there's a currency that I find different in terms of what CENVIC provides compared to other types of peak bodies, is that we have a culture of collaboration. And that's something that I know is inherent in the arts. It's inherent in the creative process. And so there are many things that unify us and is part of our DNA. And what CENVIC tries to provide its members is a unique place to just come together with other people who are struggling with similar types of challenges. Those challenges of balancing the purpose with the organisational, perhaps business interests. I think no one wants to focus on the business and organisational interests. And Grace, that's what you're saying are part of these key findings. And that is common to people who are passionate about helping people who are marginalised, who are facing intergenerational unemployment or intergenerational incarceration. This is what drives those passionate people who are involved in that type of work. And so we need a place to come together, and that's what CENVIC is also trying to do. So part of my message today is to invite those who are here to join CENVIC and to be part of this, this new community that we're growing. This research though, why I'm so proud to be here today is that it's a real important marker in trying to articulate and make sense and measure these important steps and the value of the artistic community in social enterprise, because we are operating in hybrids and we need to speak more confidently of our place in those hybrids. And an important part of that is that research, that ability to carve our place so that when we speak to government, when we speak to philanthropy and the corporate sector, we can say, oh no, we're not over here, we're not profit-oriented businesses, and we're not charities wholly reliant on donations or, you know, hand in glove with philanthropy. We're something in the middle, which speaks to a number of different things about self-sufficiency and other things that come through in the research we see today. We need to carve out a stronger place there, and I think this research really gives the artistic community a strong place in that wider movement. So with that, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I look forward to a really stimulating conversation with the panel today, and thank you all, and happy to take questions later on if time permits.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Grace. I will allow a couple of questions just briefly now so that people, you know, sometimes they forget. So I can see there's one from Ben who asked a question about the sense of how long funding streams with longer planning cycles could be. Do you want to try and answer that one, Grace?
Yeah, sure. And great to see you there, Ben. Well, not to see you, but to know that you're there. Look, we can speak to what the organisations that we've interviewed have, you know, outlined to us, and that really speaks to what is currently happening. It's not aspirational in terms of what could happen or what should happen, but certainly, you know, funding streams that have a sort of 3 to 4 year life cycle were the ones that organisations spoke about as having the greatest impact, allowing them to think forward, to plan forward, which then enabled them to be more innovative in terms of developing both new revenue streams, but also to really support and focus and sharpen their work with young people. In terms of aspirational, you know, wouldn't it be fantastic to see funding streams that were longer than that? I don't know how practicable that is from a philanthropic point of view, and Ben, you probably have some thoughts on that. So it might be nice for us to come back to that sort of at the end of the discussion and get your perspective, Ben.
Wonderful. And Nick, there's a question for you as well. Question about, can you elaborate about the evaluation, the kind of economic values and numbers?
Yeah, I think this is something that the social enterprise sector is one of its great challenges too. And we will hear from Jo Barraket shortly, who's done some extraordinary work that has allowed the Victorian social enterprise community to put its case to government that it contributes $5.2 billion to the economy. And that research that CSI Swinburne has done has really put Victoria in the strongest position in terms of the commitment from government to support it. There's more to do there, and there's also push nationally to try and get the federal government engaged with this, because that's, as the arts community knows, we really need them to engage and start providing strategy and policy that supports greater clarity and consistency here. So I am avoiding answering that question, but I think it'll be something that we will talk more about shortly in the panel.
Been nicely segued to Jo. So Jo, you've been set up, just letting you know. So now we will segue to our panel speakers. So I'll briefly introduce each of them, and then they will speak for roughly about 7 minutes each, and then we can open up for a general discussion. But thanks, Nick and Grace, for wonderful opening. So this panel consists of social enterprise researchers, as well as people who work in and advocate for arts-based social enterprise sector. So our first speaker is Professor Peter Kelly, one of the chief investigators on the arts-based social enterprise research project. Peter is the head of the UNESCO UEOF at RMIT and Professor of Education in the School of Education. He is a sociologist of youth, education and work, and has published extensively on young people, globalisation, education and work. His current research interests include critical engagement with young people's well-being, resilience and enterprise, and what can be called the Anthropocene. Our second speaker is Kate Gillick, executive producer of the arts-based social enterprise Outer Urban Projects. Kate brings 30 years of professional practice across theatre, film and television to Outer Urban Projects. She is trained and worked as an actor, writer, director and producer. Kate formerly was artistic co-director and creative producer with the Anti-Racism Action Band, or ARAB as it stands, performing arts program from 2004 to 2012. Kate's commitment to art reflects the stories of working class and disenfranchised people, has seen her evolution to the executive producer of Outer Urban Projects. Our third speaker is Farah Farouque, board chair of the Social Studio, a social enterprise that nurtures the design talents of people from refugee backgrounds. Farah became a founding board member of the organisation in 2019 when she was working as a senior journalist at The Age, where she held roles including social affairs editor and law and justice editor. This year, Farah took up the new role as Director of Community Engagement at Tenants Victoria. She has previously worked at the national anti-poverty group Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, where she helped shape campaigns and did public advocacy. She is currently on a board member on the Islamic Museum of Australia. Our fourth speaker is Distinguished Professor Jo Barraket, and this is who Nick was referring to. So Jo is the director of the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne, which brings together the largest team of social economy researchers in the world. A political sociologist with a focus on both public policy and organisational practice, Jo is Australia's leading researcher of social enterprise and the wider social economy, and has additional research interest in digital inclusion and social innovation. So I'd like to now hand over firstly to Peter. And don't forget everyone, put your questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Larissa. And thank you everybody for taking the time to come along today. I think we're at 49 participants by the look of it, which is really, really great. And before I start, I'd like to also endorse the acknowledgement of country that others have made before me. In the brief amount of time that I have today, and I'll just put myself on a stopwatch so I tap out at about 6 minutes, want to pick up on a number of themes that are embedded in the critical policy brief and think about them in terms of where they come from as research findings, but where it is that we might go with them as well, particularly in the context of the crises and disruptions that we are in the middle of and which will shape our futures as long as those futures continue to be shaped by such things as climate change and digital disruption and the challenges that they produce for young people, and particularly for those young people on the margins. And that's what I want to speak to a bit about today, drawing on the sort of work that I've done over the last 20 years, where I've focused as a sociologist of youth and a sociologist of education and work with those young people who are marginalised or who are at risk, and find it difficult to engage in the mainstream and the sorts of interventions and programs and projects that are developed to engage those young people. So what I want to pick up on today is this idea of well-being and engagement. I then want to segue a little bit into some discussion about skills, because so much of the conversation at this point in time in terms of a COVID recovery for young people, particularly at the federal government level, has been focused on a fairly narrow definition of skills, which tends to also focus on the supply side of labour and positions young people as either possessing the skills or not that enable them to participate. And I think there's a real point there when we think about those. I want to then think about what that means in terms of the impact that social enterprises might have in this space, because a lot of what I want to talk about is often understood in terms of outcomes, but very rarely in terms of impacts. And one of the challenges there is that impacts in terms of health and well-being and engagement and or in a particular way of understanding skills are really hard to measure and or capture. It's much easier to say, for instance, that 75% of the young people who participated in our program went on to another program with very little about what impact a program might have had. So as Larissa said, I head the UNESCO Youthworx Centre, which is UNESCO's global network for skills for the world of work. And one of the things that the RMIT Youthworx Centre concentrate on are young people's skills and transitions and employment pathways in times of crisis and disruption. And we've developed two key ideas that we work with here that emerge from work there, but also are central to this particular project. One is trying to move from a focus on an individual young person's health and well-being and engagement to think about the ecologies of well-being and engagement and the ways in which social enterprises and other organisations can develop ecologies in which young people can engage, can develop well-being broadly understood, really broadly understood. We could go down into what aspects of well-being we're talking about, but there's not enough time for that. Because what we're talking about here is, if you like, a pyramid, and at the base is this solid foundation or not of health and well-being. On top of that base of health and well-being, you can think about engagement, particularly for those young people who have been profoundly disengaged. Social enterprises often deal with those young people who have been profoundly disengaged for a long period of time. And that bedrock is really important before you even start to think about skills and capabilities, and then transitions and pathways that might emerge from the development of skills and capabilities. So I think too often there's a focus on the individual in these circumstances, and we need to shift the thinking into thinking about ecologies of well-being and engagement that enable us to think more broadly about what it is that we might do in terms of working with young people in these contexts. Other thing is thinking about skills. If that's up the top of the pyramid there, what sort of things are we talking about in skills? And a lot of these social enterprises work in providing accredited training that's often delivered in partnership with RMIT or Melbourne Polytechnic or somewhere else. Skills are often narrowly defined in a competency-based training context. What we want to do is think about broadening out the understanding of skills. There are a number of models for thinking about that, including the idea of 21st century skills and capabilities that have a focus on some foundational literacies, some core competencies, but also then things like what might be called character qualities: curiosity, initiative, persistence, adaptability, and leadership. the art space, social enterprise space is a really important place for the development of some of those 21st century capabilities. But it's incredibly difficult to capture what they are and the ways in which the social enterprise itself might have some impact in the development of those 21st century capabilities that are said to be really important for the developing world of work, particularly where that world of work increasingly locks young people in greater numbers out of full-time decent work, as SDG 8, UN Sustainable Development Goal, talks about economic growth and decent work for all. And I think that's a real challenge going forward, to imagine what decent work for all is, particularly when we're talking about the young people that we're talking about in this context. So I think that relationship between an ecological understanding of wellbeing and engagement, and a much broader understanding of skills and capabilities, and then the challenges of thinking about the ways in which they can be developed within programs that are often narrowly defined around a set of core competencies in an accredited training process, and then funded often in terms of outcomes and not impacts. I finished by saying I think there's the work that we do at Youthworx in terms of crisis and disruption made reference for the last 5 or 6 years to the global financial crisis as the last great crisis that confronted economies around the world and had a disproportionate impact on young people for over a decade. If you look at the Productivity Commission recent report that looked at the loss of income over that period for young people in the last decade, I think we're at a profound, if you like, event horizon, to borrow a term from astrophysics, beyond which is a lot of unknowability and uncertainty. And I think some of these challenges that we've identified in this project have to be taken forward into a whole variety of new partnerships and collaborations and projects to work with the most vulnerable in the context of that uncertainty and crisis that we currently face. And that's me out.
Exceptional timekeeping. Oh, you make a chair very happy. Thank you, Peter. So there's some wonderful points there about, thinking, reconceptualizing in terms of ecologies of well-being. And it was really great, Peter, for bringing in the kind of SDGs and particularly decent work. What does decent work for all mean? And I really like that analogy of the event horizon, which my 10-year-old has been looking at black holes recently. So I understand that is the actual, that's the, what is it? The edge of
that point beyond which
we
don't know what happens. And COVID is, in lots of respects, an event horizon that produces profound uncertainty.
Yes, so a lovely metaphor to finish with. So thank you very much. I've got, so I'll leave the questions and for the end of the panel once all 4 speakers, but we've already got some questions here about measuring 21st century skills, and there's some other questions. So thank you everyone for adding your questions. Keep adding your questions. We love your questions. Next, I'm going to hand over to Kate.
I shall unmute.
Thank you.
I'm going to screen share, so I was just checking in that I've got that capacity, the co-host, just as I go. So I've got 7 minutes max. Yep, that's the limit. So hi everybody. My name's Kate, and I also wanted to acknowledge that we're on Wurundjeri country, and to acknowledge elders past and present, and also the extraordinary inspirational Indigenous art movements and waves of movements, both in Victoria and nationally and on the islands, that are always a point of inspiration for us, because if you look at everything from fibre art in the visual arts to Western Desert to film to performance, there's so many examples of fantastic sort of pushing forward despite all odds. So I would also, I will refer to a couple of those movements later, but I wanted to acknowledge that as well. So today I'll just introduce you to the company, our organisation, Outer Urban Projects, and I'll share screen if I can now. Hang on, is it working? Yes, it is. There we go. Everyone see that? Yep, beauty. So when I want to thank and acknowledge this research team of Grace, Peter, Amy, and the rest of the researchers when they approached Outer Urban Projects to be part of a 3-year research project. We immediately thought, oh, social enterprise, that's just part of what we do. And of course, the research was saying, guys, everything you do is comes under what we understand as social enterprise. And we are a company that's only around 8 years old. We're an iconic performing arts company that develops emerging artists and subverts the Australian canon while affirming the complex face of our nation. We work mainly in the outer northern suburbs, but increasingly connecting with other artists in outer urban areas within Melbourne. I want to also acknowledge we have a fantastic hardworking team. I co-CEO with the Artistic Director, Irene Vella, General Manager, David Ralph, and the rest of our team who really reflect our community and our core values in what they have lived and what they have experienced, and their fight to be to be independent artists and to do the work that we do within our community. So I think they're all on today, and I just want to acknowledge that. Obviously the core team, as well as our participants and artists and all our partners, make up who we are as a company. And so when I'm speaking about Outer Urban Projects, that's who I'm speaking about. It's that wide cohort, as well as our core team and the wonderful partnerships that we have. So really I want to just scroll through some of the and talk from the point of view of some of our artists that are speaking throughout this document, which is our strategic plan for the next few years. And I'll just read a couple of quotes out because I think it really nails really what the importance of having organisations like ourselves, this kind of work, which really addresses such a huge gap in people being able to live an artistic life, but also work within an artistic life. And this is Sarah Davudi, who's an associate artist with the company. She says, knowing that there is an opportunity for an artist such as me, who is seeking asylum, who is an immigrant, to show her work is a great motivator. It only takes one good connection to give someone purpose and hope, and I believe I have made a good connection. So that's Sarah Davudi, and her work with us is just increasing all the time, and she is able to have a place as a working performer and developing as a writer more and more with us, but not just with us, but in the broader community of Melbourne, which is now her home. And there's another artist, I'll just quickly scroll, there's Sarah there. Quickly scroll down to another artist, Ruthie Kaisela, who and she says, I got involved with Outer Urban Projects in 2014, and since then I have featured in many of their works and became a tutor in their workshops. I was recently cast in a major festival show called Anthem, where I got to work alongside some of Australia's most respected writers, directors and actors. The opportunity to be in the workshops and then to audition for the show was made possible by Outer Urban Projects, and this show has been one of the greatest experiences for me as a young artist. Coming from the northern suburbs of Broadmeadows, I never imagined I'd have these opportunities. I think that it's important because I'm able to set an example for not only Pacific Island kids, but also those who've grown up in urban ghetto areas. We can do so much more than what people think, Ruthie Kaisela. And I think, and that's Ruthie up on stage at the Melbourne Festival. She went on to do a national tour of that work. She was introduced to that work through our artistic director, Irene Vella, but she was able to really hit her straps, do her best, connect, and really have a permanent connection in her world of performing arts through that. And we are just one of many organisations, obviously, that do this work. But what I want to say in responding to the report, especially around funding, and I'm going to draw an analogy because I know we don't have a lot of time, but Outer Urban Projects, in a way, we're there to make that really seminal connection for people who are trying to express themselves, who want to work. And when my dad died a few years ago, and he donated his body to Melbourne Uni, where the medical students really need those bodies. And it's a strange analogy, I know, but bear with me. And the medical students did a wonderful ceremony about really the absorption of that knowledge once they were able to do what they did with the anatomy. And it was knowledge that was there forever in their bodies, and that would then obviously, and their mind and body as doctors would then be passed on into the future. And that absorption of knowledge that they could not get through the textbooks. And in a way, we play a similar role, that when people are investing, and Our Urban Projects probably makes 25% through earned income and fee for service. But we also, as the report says, we are really dependent on that hybrid model. So when people are investing in this company, you are investing in legacy deeply. You are investing in that individual who then reflects what they can be, what people can be, how they can work within the arts, that they also have an equal place. And that goes out to their families, their peers, the audiences, and to the culture in general, and to the arts landscape, and to the wider Australian population. So the ripple effect of that knowledge, of that kind of investment where that connection is made, is so potent and powerful. And I think sometimes in the rush of funding and in the business of funding, then that connection between those that are out in the field, like ourselves, and the artists that are working in the funders sometimes get lost. But I think it's really essential that also funders understand that ripple effect, that knowledge will go on, and it'll go on generationally. And that's a powerful thing, matched with fee for service, obviously, as well. We couldn't do the fee for service without that hybrid model. And obviously those longer term funding arrangements are very important to us. I think I'm probably running out of time, but that's to me, we've rolled out something like 1,000 employment contracts over the last few years to something like 250 emerging and established artists, the majority coming out from the outer northern suburbs. And so this work for us is extremely important to keep going over the generations, and so that you actually start to shift culture within Australia in a much, much bigger way. So that's probably it from us. But we've been delighted to be part of this research and to have that critical reflection on our work and on the work of others and the broader sector. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Kate. That was wonderful. I asked, would you mind sharing that report in the chat or a URL for that report?
Yeah, I think so. I'll probably have to check that the whole can be shared.
Okay, yeah, cool. Because it's just so fascinating. You just opened it up, and I'm like, oh, you know, so.
All right. I'm going to stop sharing. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's the only way to show some, some of the artists and them speaking.
Yeah, fantastic, really inspiring stuff. So now I'm going to pass over to our third speaker, Farouque, who's the board chair of the fantastic Social Studio. Thank you.
Sorry, I've fallen for the 21st century trick. You're on mute. You didn't even have to remind me, Chair. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you. Firstly, what a wonderful report. I love the way it's so pithy. We, in our ability to understand information is so challenged in these times, and I just want to compliment the report's contents, but also its layout and the way it makes its key messages clear. I also want to acknowledge the land we're speaking on. I'm on Wurundjeri land, but I also cannot proceed without a tribute to one of your co-authors, Grace McQuilten, a dear friend, the founder of the Social Studio, and an inspirational person in the way, she's able to look at the academic literature, but also in the practical implementation of it. So, I've learned a lot from her, and the Social Studio simply wouldn't exist if not for her imagination. So yes, so that's she will be overwhelmed by my compliments, but I have to say it. So yes, so I've been the board chair of the Social Studio which is now a 10+ year organisation for 9 years, and I was a founding board member of the organisation. And it is a really interesting space. My day job, I work in the not-for-profit sector, in around welfare offerings, etc. I've worked at the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence for 7 years, and the work of the Brotherhood is a particular kind of welfare work. But what the striking thing that people say when they come to the social studio, which has a retail offering, a manufacturing hub, and a fashion school, is that it does not feel like a welfare offering. And that is one of its most attractive components to the young people we work with, from refugee backgrounds principally, but we also have other new migrant backgrounds. And they are not looking to be seen as recipients of welfare services, particularly, highly marginalised young people. They want to be, seen for their talents and creativity. And I'm not saying other welfare models don't speak to that. Of course they do. But in this social studio, the marriage of art, enterprise, and training, you have a really unique opportunity to tap into global youth culture, creativity, but also it's not some sort of soft option, because we have been very focused from the start. Our current CEO, Davy Cook, is here, and I want to pay tribute to her as well. She's been very busy with meetings this morning, speaking to these very issues. We are very focused on outcomes, and outcomes are, we want our students and people who do our programs or interact with us to we look to employ them, for a time within our social enterprise, but we also look for them to seek out further education opportunities and also employment outcomes, which sometimes is within our social enterprise, but most often not in other spheres. So we have people who become fashion designers, certainly, or enter manufacturing. But our scope is much broader than that. As previous speakers have spoken about, the soft skills and the creative skills have a very wide range of application. And in fact, we are so proud that currently one of our earliest graduates is near completion of her PhD in medical science. She her first bit of constructive, student engagement was within the confines of the social studio. Similarly, we have a young person, Ali, who actually 2 generations of his family have been through the social studio. He grew up in public housing, and he arrived with very little English at the age of 12. And because he's an immensely motivated young man, he connected to the social studio, not doing our programs, but doing work experience. And the social studio was able to direct him to, seek another job, actually in a takeaway food shop. And from then he built. He last year graduated from Monash in political science. He's been accepted into an ANU master's degree in doing the diplomacy. His ambition is to join DFAT. He is spent 10 years in public housing, and actually during this interregnum, during the due to COVID, I've had the good fortune as at Tenants Victoria to employ him in his first for 6 months on a project, on his first job outside of his university, and he's excelling. During the course of this conversation, he texted me with another one of his achievements. So, I mean, we have so many good news stories, and they make up really, very impressive statistics. And I'll share this little slide via the chat. But for example, last year, and these are small numbers because we are, we're a small social enterprise, but one with grand ambition and one in which we also share our IP with others, and we've managed to incubate 6 other organizations around the country. But within our last year, we had 20 people complete Certificate 3 with RMIT in manufacturing, and we also, well, they were enrolled, not all completed, but we also had 40 people doing our social sewing programs. And of those 60, so they are small numbers, we had I had to double check this figure, we had a 96% retention and completion rate. I did prosecute that very thoroughly this morning because I said, you know, I know we do well, but was it indeed 96%? But there were small numbers, but we regularly and repeatedly have, you know, well in excess of 90% retention and completion. And I think that speaks to the model, you know, the creative nature of the model where we operate. So it's, you know, the social studio is not just a place for learning, it's a place for belonging. And that's something we, you know, it's a key message actually that we you know, spoken to and actually, you know, exemplify. Can I also mention in terms of the key points in the critical policy brief, I couldn't agree with them more. You know, we actually exemplify all those points. Firstly, during this, you know, intensely demanding COVID phase, interestingly, we were able to attract JobKeeper and get other funding, and philanthropic funding was very generous because we were able to pivot, because we're a creative social enterprise, we were able to pivot, instead of making clothes, we were able to make masks and scrubs, and that in itself was a funding source, but it also brought a lot of philanthropic support. The philanthropic support actually far exceeded that of the money we could bring in from our masks and scrubs, but it showed our energy and enterprise, which was attractive to funders. But we weren't able to attract any funding from Creative Victoria during this period because we didn't fall into their funding streams. I thought that was interesting. I'm not complaining, I just share that piece of information. So I think there is greater scope for operational funding for arts-based social enterprises, and I hope you know, with time we will have those opportunities to qualify for that type of funding. Our main source of funding has largely been philanthropics. We also generated our funding, you know, in a period of you know, good fortune. We could say we were, you know, 60% philanthropics and others and donors, and then 40% self-generated, but we're currently at 80-20. You know, COVID's taken a deep toll on that particular, you know, tabulation. But I think, look, that is certainly true. The demand for, you know, profit and the sort of outcomes we're seeking, the employment opportunities we seek to offer don't always go hand in hand. So, yeah, I think that's a really key learning there. And I urge those who have influence to consider that in future equations. Yes, so look, the COVID phase, I just want to end by saying the COVID phase has been deeply challenging, but it really is a testament to the arts-based social enterprise model that we have emerged stronger than ever in a sense, because we've been tested, we've shown our capability to pivot, we've remained engaged with our students despite having to resort to remote learning. And if you have the time, please come on to our Facebook site where we have this really beautiful tableau of one of our teachers who went to extraordinary lengths to share learnings with students, to the extent of just using a simple mobile phone from his home and actually, you know, going through the sewing classes, etc. It speaks to innovation, because innovation doesn't have to be Silicon Valley. It can be much more grassroots. And I strongly believe that our social enterprise demonstrates that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Two fantastic, compelling examples. I've just put in the chat. Now, sorry, Kate, for embarrassing you asking for the report, and then it's not actually a public report. So I put the URL for people to have a look at the website.
Oh, so, no, thanks for that. No, that's okay. Yeah, because it's our strategic plan. So I'm like, oh, I'm not putting it out there. I'm
always, you know, sending out secret messages out on everything.
No, that's okay. No, get on the website. That's good.
But thank you both. Now I'm just mindful of time. We have got a question about funding streams, and I think there's been some really good issues about, like, thinking about those kind of both models provide and present very different hybrid models. So we might come back to that question in the general Q&A time. So I'd like to now hand over to distinguished Professor Jo Barraket to speak for about 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and for that subtle 7 minutes. I promise I'm keeping an eye on it, but you can also just cut me off at any time. I first want to acknowledge that I'm also on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to elders past and present. And also offer my congratulations to the research team and the organisations involved in this very important piece of work. And also my thanks for your generosity in inviting me along. I think many of us are very aware of the rather parlous situation the university sector alongside the arts sector is in at the moment. And one of the things that gives me a great deal of heart warmth and strength is that while our institutions are, fiercely competing with each other at all times, academics don't usually compete. We usually find reasons to work together. So I really appreciate the invitation to come along. I was, I think, given this slot partly to draw together some reflections on comments that were made through the panel, as well as to give you a few facts and figures. And I just want to quickly pick up on Nick's earlier comments and his absolute discretion in not pronouncing the statistics on Victorian social enterprises, even though he's more than welcome to do so at any time he wishes, and doesn't need to be polite because I'm on the call. But to answer that question, as Nick said, the social enterprise sector in Victoria contributes about 5.2 billion to the Victorian economy, which in past times, not right now, is the equivalent of the aviation industry. If you look at the role of arts and cultural sector within that, then 29% of social enterprises in Victoria are within the cultural and recreation sectors. Now, just saying this makes me really aware, because it's been part of my work for good, bad or other reasons over the years to do these numbers, is that you can present the numbers in whatever ways you wish to. And I think that that's something for this group of scholars and practitioners to be thinking about, is what's the best story, what's the most compelling story for which group to be told, because of course the creative industries are a very significant part of the new economy and part of STEM. So if you want to get into the sort of dominance of particular narratives, then there's a good one to just tap into straight away. But then there's, I guess, a question which is, partly alluded to in Grace and Peter's comments, which is the role that we want to see social enterprise and arts-based enterprising organisations playing in the world, their intrinsic value and the extent to which we want to buy into an old economic discourse or be part of the new economic discourse that Nick mentioned. And I've got a query around that. I don't know the answer because I spend too much of my life in the social enterprise space, but I'm just wondering whether for specifically arts-based social enterprises, whether there is a wider story around inclusive and diverse economy, rather than trying to lock arts-based social enterprises into a box around social enterprise and then get very focused on that definition about the majority of trade of income being brought in through trade. So I don't have an answer to it, but I'm the creator of that definition from which that particular point comes. And two things to say about it. One was, it was always meant to be a conversation starter. The definition was never intended to be the last word, and it is there for the people to break open as they see fit. But second part about it is to acknowledge that aspect of what social enterprise is widely recognised in most definitions around the world. So rather than problematising arts-based social enterprises or enterprising organisations, I guess my query is, maybe we've got some more, have we got some more work to do around the discourse of what a creative, inclusive and diverse economy looks like, rather than trying to force everyone into a box. In terms of the specific topic and the critical policy brief, just very quickly, because I think one of the reasons Grace asked me to speak is that we've recently completed another ARC linkage project on youth health equity and social enterprise, which looked at 4 case studies of social enterprise outside of the arts sector. And they are all explicitly what we call work integration social enterprises that have a strong focus on creating employment or pathways to employment for young people who are experiencing multiple forms of disadvantage. There's a number of really significant resonances with the work that is being presented today. One is around, what Peter described as the different kinds of skills, and what both Kate and Farah spoke about meeting young people or any people where they're at, which is the really classic characteristic of what we see in what Farah referred to as the model. And the other bit that really struck me from what both Farah and Kate said was around place of belonging, like, you know, feeling that you belong, and also a place in which you get to know yourself, your craft, your aspirations, etc. Also, you know, they're part of those precondition or pre-skill development things that Peter talked about, and very prevalent across the sector. The other thing I guess I wanted to just pick up on from what's been found in this research that are important. I think, you know, that message is we're not a welfare service, and one of the reasons we're attractive is because we're not a welfare service. Again, that reflects the very people-centred design of social enterprise, but I also think sometimes explicitly and sometimes not explicitly, it also reflects the systemic thinking of social enterprises. So social enterprises are often not in a specific box. We've talked about hybridity, right? So they're trading in industries that are different to the cohort groups that they're seeking to assist, which may again be different to the geography in which they're working. So there's a whole lot of different hybridities going on. Then there's the industry that you focus on. So many social enterprises, and I imagine would be true of arts-based social enterprises, identify much more with the industry that they work in than they do with the fact that they're a social enterprise. So that goes back to Kate's very early comment on being involved in this research. So there's a whole lot of different kinds of hybridity that are at work. And I think that means that social enterprises are trying to fill gaps in systems and trying to knit broken bits of systems together. And I don't mean to be overly romantic about it, because then we get to the issue of your scale. And Kate actually mentioned a very interesting number there, around 1,000 jobs over a couple of years, although I gathered from the next part of your sentence, Kate, that they're fairly short-term positions for the most part. Yeah. But Farah also talked about scaling through replication and through incubating other social enterprises. I think one of the things we need to do in this space is not get too caught up in buying into the mainstream business language of what scaling looks like. If you're talking about scaling impacts, there are multiple ways to do that. But going back to my comment on the research, and then I'll be quiet so that we can get into Q&A, is this focus on being people-centred, offering different kinds of opportunities that range from the emotional through to the technical, that give people the space to give expression to who they are. And that has very powerful consequences, both for health and wellbeing and for work. But also, I think, recognising that at the moment in the Australian context, social enterprise as a whole is relatively marginal in terms of policy frameworks and investments. If you then drill down to arts-based social enterprises, and we know that as an industry, arts and cultural workers are the most precarious and always have been in the Australian economy. There's a number of different challenges there, and I don't want to end sounding like a negative Nancy, because you know, I've been studying and working with social enterprise for 25 years for a reason. I clearly believe there's something useful and creative and innovative here. But I do think that probably need to work out which battles people, organisations wish to fight, and which narratives are going to best enable them to do that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jo. And you really kept to that 7 minutes, and a fantastic synthesis as well of some of these kind of key issues. The chat has been, there have been a few questions and people answering in the chat around kind of some of the conceptualization, and also the slide for Social Studio with the infographics about the kind of has been included there, so people can kind of click on there. Now, I'm just wanting to now open up to general questions. I think, Nick, did you want to actually talk through the answer, the kind of comment that you put here in the chat for the group? Well,
no, I don't need to, other than I think it is worth noting that it's the reality of achieving the definition of social enterprise, which is to have majority of your income coming from trade, is definitely a challenge for all social enterprises, and I suppose the artists community in particular, I would say. So, you know, when we look at our membership definition, we have a bias to inclusion. So if you have the intention to be a social enterprise, to generate enough income so that it is more than the majority, then you are welcome to join us. And I think that's part of the recognition of where much of Senvic, much of social enterprise operates, where the market has failed or governments have failed. So those challenges are enormous. So to expect that you can immediately have a profitable organisation, that's not the reality. And so, that's an important foundation of how Senvic is trying to build this community.
Wonderful. Joe's put in there, so Joe's also put the report in there, fantastic, about Victorian social enterprise. Thank you for that, mapped for impact. And she's also mentioned, storytelling, because one of the things that was coming up is like the kind of how we communicate the findings, and then the kind of stories that they tell to what stakeholders to mobilise, kind of the minds and hearts of people. So, Joe, did you want to talk a little bit to storytelling, or shall I hand to someone else in the panel?
Just really, really quickly, I think it's just more of the assets-based thinking. So the strengths-based approach was observed in this project. It was also very strongly observed in the project we've just finished. And it's what social entrepreneurs and social innovators do, right? They look sideways at a disused resource and they see value in it and they come up with a new way of using it. And I guess this is my very lame version of that, which is there are huge assets in the arts and cultural sector for storytelling, and there is desperate need for storytelling beyond our dear friends at Digital Storytellers, who are only one organisation. There's a lot of pressure on the social enterprise sector, I think, to tell its stories better. So I can see a perfect meeting of capability and need.
Definitely. Grace, did you want to, I know you've spoken quite a bit about storytelling in the past, and the kind of particular genres in the field. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I think Joe's absolutely right. The complexity of what social enterprises are trying to do really does rely on a very adept ability to speak to diverse communities. How do you translate extreme social hardship into an experience that will engage broad communities, inspire them to get involved, to buy products and services, to donate, to volunteer. So it is, and it's also one of the great challenges that we've observed in talking to people involved in art-based social enterprises around Australia. How do you tell the story without further marginalising or stigmatising the very people that you're working with? So it's both crucial to what the organisations do, and it's also one of the hardest things that they do. And it depends on who the stakeholders are. So if you're speaking to your funders, you do have to talk about social disadvantage, marginalisation and hardship. You can't just talk about strengths and skills and capacities, because funders aren't really wanting to fund that. So you have to be able to speak to the deficits that the organisations are addressing. But at the same time, by doing that, you can actually further entrench the very disadvantage that you're trying to transform or change. And so we found that managers, entrepreneurs in these organisations spend a lot of time thinking about how they tell their story, who their audience is, how they change the story depending on who they're speaking to, and also how to challenge what's expected of them in terms of telling their story as well. That's one of the hardest things, I think, for practitioners in social enterprises. How do you say no to what funders or the broader sector are asking of you? How do you do that when most, they often don't hold all of the power? And so that was an interesting and a key, I guess, driver for us to be able to try to communicate some of the more challenging or critical observations of the social enterprises we were interviewing, because it's hard for them to do that directly.
Wonderful. I've got some more questions here, so I'm just going to read all the questions and just dob people in for them. So this was another question that Grace actually segues quite well into what you were talking about, because Anne asked about the question around policy, what and who is the audience, what they're listening to, and, who's listening to these recommendations. And, the whole, I suppose, the kind of what a policy brief does, you know, in terms of that research translation piece, I think would be, you know, knowledge transmission, and also kind of activating perhaps, you know, ideas of implementation. So that's one question. There's also the question about just different funding streams, which I think would be more open. That would be a question more for Kate and Farah, who had already started talking about that, but just talking about you know, where does the funding come from? Major donors, smaller amounts, everyday people, both, and just maybe a little bit of elaboration around that. And then the third question is for Peter about distinguishing systems and program-based characteristics, aside from personalities of the youth, that provide a stronger bedrock of wellbeing in community. So yeah, so I'll go through. Grace can answer the first question. Kate and Farah will answer the second, and then Peter, if you can answer the third that's in the chat there, that would be great.
Thanks, Larissa. So as I mentioned in the chat, because art-based social enterprises are working across a range of different sectors, we don't have a singular audience for the policy brief, and we are hoping to reach policymakers and policy advisors across different areas in government, so arts policy, education, and also employment or jobs creation. We also want to reach out and communicate the findings to the social enterprise sector more broadly, so intermediaries and advocates in the sector, which is why it's so great to have both Joe and Nick here kind of engaged with the research. And we also are hoping that we can reach other art-based social enterprises that we haven't connected with sort of through the project. But we don't want it to be we give information to industry process, and we actually want it to be a dialogue and a process of testing out our findings, and as Joe has pointed out, brilliantly thinking through what diverse and inclusive economies might look like and how social enterprise fits into that, and informing policy makers and people in different sectors, not by telling them what we think, but by talking to them about what we found, and trying to understand their perspectives and how our research can communicate, I guess, more effectively across, from practitioners to industry.
Wonderful. And I think that's a real key point, that you're showing rather than telling. And I think that's really important for that discussion. Kate and Farah, did you want to talk about the funding streams just briefly, like from your experience?
Well, yes, I think the query was, who are our funders? Yes, so we have a strong support from the philanthropic community, but that is not a never-ending stream. So there are a lot of the private trusts, and we have the PAFs, as they're called. I'm not sure quite what that stands for. I need to read that out afresh, but I can send it through on the chat shortly. And also the normal philanthropic foundations. We've had very strong support from Ian Potter Foundation right from the start. They've been really wonderful. And there's another foundation, the Baker Foundation, which has a lot of flexibility in how they operate, and they've been a very strong champion of us. So we've been able to build close relationships with a couple of key funders who have been with us in challenging times. And so that's, they're not the only two. I just mentioned them as long-standing, funders. But one, about halfway into our life, we also realized we need to do more with individual donors. We're not talking about people who, have large sums, but who also, apart from giving small cash outlays, also you can build connection. They'll come to your functions. They'll champion you. They'll seek new opportunities. So in fact, as we speak, a young GP who has been a strong, individual donor is going to be doing an article for the Australian Doctor, and she was going to wear one of our masks. That kind of thing builds a footprint. So we interpret the word fund. Obviously, we need money, and governments have chipped in, but that has not been our mainstay. We want we want a closer relationship, obviously, with government, as anybody does. But, you know, we've had to diversify and, of course, generate our own funds. But, you know, there's a lot of opportunities within the kind of individual relationships as well. From small funds, big funds grow. That's how we see it. And at a critical time, you know, former Arts Minister Foley, I have to acknowledge, did come to give us a quite a critical grant at a sensitive time in our development, and we were very grateful for that injection. So that's our funding story.
Wonderful. I was just in chat. Emily's just mentioned that there is sorry, the chat says that the Vic government is doing a public consultation at the moment to inform their new youth strategy at the moment. So they'd love to hear from entrepreneurs and researchers in this space, and they've done a URL. So that's very important because obviously, as it's been pointed out a few times by Nick and Joe, that this is a $5.2 billion economy, and it's like, well, government, show us the money. You know, like where's the support and things like that. So, and given that everything has been thrown into, yes,
I just want to say one. I in my rush, I also have to acknowledge the Inner North Community Foundation. You know, they are not. They're not one of those, you know, huge philanthropic type of arms. They work differently in community, and they have been vital from the start. In fact, our first bequest has come via the Inner North Community Foundation, and it's interesting, isn't it, that that after 10 years we received, you know, our first substantial bequest, which is also something we need to develop.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Kate, do you have like sorry, I'm just getting very mindful of the time. Do you have a couple of?
Yeah, look, I think I won't list all the foundations, but we're funded by both state and federal arts agencies, Australia Council and Creative Victoria, as well as, you know, quite a wide cohort of philanthropic organisations, including the fabulous Inner North Foundation, who are just so rock solid, but lots of organisations. I won't list them all, but as well as being able to generate, I think around last year about $250,000 in fee for service came in. But of course, what we need is always is a really solid core team, and the money for that core team to be able to do what we do in the day-to-day, and that's always the hardest thing to get. And I think what I'd like to see is that sort of acknowledgement that there's not ghost workers or contract workers are doing this work. It's people with vision, both from board level through to your core team and your leadership teams, and people that you're developing from the communities into those ongoing positions that are the gold, actually, that are going to care enough to stick around and do the work and stick to mission. And so that's, I think, something that's really important, and that's where long-term funding really has a huge impact. But I think we are very interested in any discussion that shakes up current models or current thinkings, and to be open to dialogue like this fabulous research. And Grace and I have talked about this many times, that actually shake up the sort of the relationship in a way, or the dialogue, so that it shifts that sort of power dynamic, if you like, of those that are asking and those that are giving. And I know that the progressive organisations are kind of so over that, but there's still a long way to go, I think, in that. And obviously process of applications, you know, there's nothing like one organisation years ago came out, they researched us, they came out on site, they did immersive sort of research, they paid someone to come out and do it. And actually that was their application process. You know, it was quite extraordinary to kind of sort of flip it around a bit. So there's lots of different ways to go. But yeah, I think it's always going to be a hybrid model. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. And I think this research kind of burst the bubble a bit on the trying to be 100% self-sustaining, which is just
and I mean,
for us impossible to do in this time frame.
Yes, and I mean the report is very timely with everything that's happened with the pandemic, and that sustainable work practices has come really to the forefront. I'm just going to hand over briefly to Peter, so I'm not leaving you that much time, Peter. If you could just comment, there was a question about, I suppose, fleshing out that ecologies of well-being concept.
And I think this is one of the things where further work needs to be done, particularly in the context of a COVID-19 event horizon, the ways in which we imagine and talk of new models, the relationship between young people's health and well-being, their engagement, education, training and employment pathways, and the sorts of skills and capabilities that whole variety of institutions, including social enterprises, are able to develop for sustainable development, decent work for all, those sorts of things. So I think it's not so much what we know from doing this research, other than we need to develop those new models and new understandings and further work in that space.
Wonderful. Now I'm very mindful of time, and I've been told that I have to finish the meeting before 1:30 so that people can get to their other meetings, because this is the problem in the Zoomlandia world, is it never seems to be factored in that you've actually got to get across. So I'd firstly like to just thank all our wonderful esteemed speakers. What a compelling, I feel like we've only just started to sketch this. Really, there's so many fantastic comments and thoughts, and it really is so timely given everything that's been happening in terms of rethinking work practices, thinking about sustainability, etc. And so I feel like we could have a series of these panels actually. So I'd like to thank all the speakers for their wonderful talks. I'd like to thank Grace, and I'd like to thank Nick for doing the fantastic launch of the policy. And if people want to check in the chat, there's been lots of URLs in there, so there's lots of things that people can now go and take away from this meeting. And I'd like to thank the audience, because it's even though we couldn't hear all of you and we couldn't see all of you because some of you had you blacked on screen, it's wonderful that we can start this conversation. And please look to CAST website, which is the Contemporary Art and Social Transformation website. This has the policy brief there, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.